I'm just going to show how we can set keyframes on a really simple object and change the timing of those keyframes. So you can do this along with me if you want to. It's a really simple exercise. I'm just going to create a cube, and I'm going to do some animation with this cube so that we can look at keyframes and how to manage timing. If you want to, yep. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to set a start keyframe and an end keyframe so that my cube slides across the screen. Currently I'm at frame 0 on my timeline. My cube's just in the middle of my scene. I'm going to select my cube and I'm going to hit the key button down here, which sets a keyframe for its position, rotation and scale. So that has created a keyframe at frame 0 for this object. I'm going to go forward 1 second, which is 25 frames. I'm going to move my cube across and I'm going to hit the keyframe button again. So I'm recording this cube's position at this frame, frame 25. So now I've got 2 keyframes, one at frame 0, one at frame 25, and they show the cube in 2 different places. Now the computer does the in-between animation for us. So now we've got a cube that moves from side to side. So there's just some really basic keyframes set. Now when we've set some keyframes to produce some animation, if I select this object, I can see on my timeline I've got some little wee dashes underneath my frame numbers, and those represent the keyframes that this object has. I can retime these if I want to by clicking and dragging these around. It's a little fiddly though, it's not the easiest thing to do, and it would be nice if there's a much simpler, more visual way to shift these keyframes, and there is. And this is something I don't think that we've looked at yet. We've set the keyframes, we want to change the timing. So if we go to our window menu, we've got 2 different timelines for viewing our keyframes. Now these are quite important. There's a really important difference between the 2 of them. There's one called the DopeSheet. DopeSheet has nothing to do with drugs. It's a traditional 2D hand-drawn animation term, and it's a sheet that shows the timing of different animation points that need to be drawn. We've got a DopeSheet. We've also got a thing called an FCurve, which stands for a function curve. Now the big difference between these 2 is the DopeSheet controls the timing of the keyframes. The FCurve is the animation in between the keyframes. So that controls the stuff that the computer's doing automatically for us. So let's have a look at these and see what they actually do. If I click on Timeline DopeSheet, what I get is a window that shows my current object, the cube, and these little yellow boxes are indicating its keyframes. I've only got 2 keyframes, and if they're yellow it means they're selected, or if they're highlighted it means they're selected. Now the good thing about the DopeSheet is we can change the timing of these keyframes really easily. So we can select all of them if we want, and this summary track we can click and drag and we can reposition these keyframes anywhere in time. So looking at the scale of time across the top, I can say if I want my keyframes to start at frame 50, there's frame 50 there, there's my start and my end keyframes. So now I should have my animation starting at frame 50 and going to frame 75. If I want to shorten that animation so it goes quicker, I can grab my end keyframe on this cube and I can shorten it to whatever I want. Now my animation is only taking 15 frames and I can see my cube is moving much faster. So it's really easy using this DopeSheet to just grab keyframes and shift them around and change their timing. And that's great for us because I know, looking at my my Lego animation that I've got going on here, that the timing of all these different elements isn't happening at the right point in time. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on and fix that up using this DopeSheet. So the DopeSheet controls the keyframe timing of the animation. Okay, so if that's the case, what does the FCurves do? Now to change my FCurves and have a look at those, I'm actually going to put my keyframe animation back to frame 0, and I'm actually going to stretch this animation out so that it takes 50 frames. So now I've got a reasonably slow moving cube from left to right. So I'm going to close the timeline window, and with my cube selected now I'm going to go to my window and open the function curves. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the function curves control the animation in between keyframes. So what this is showing me is a little dot at each end of my animation. Those are the keyframes. In between is the motion or the movement, or you could even say it's the speed of this cube moving between the keyframes. Now you can see this is not a straight line by default. It's actually got a little bit of a curve at both ends. Cinema 4D is automatically smoothing out this motion so that if we play on the timeline, I can see, looking at that, the cube accelerates gently, it moves along, and then it slows down just before the end. Now I'm just going to duplicate my cube so that I can compare these. So if I go Command C, Command V, I've got another cube, and I'm just going to put it in a group, Option G, and move the group upwards. So now I should have two of these doing the same thing. Okay, so now I can start to compare my animation between these two cubes. So they're both doing the same animation at the moment, and here's this in-between motion that accelerates softly out of the keyframe, it moves along, and then it slows down towards the end. On my second cube that I've made, now you can use your Option and your mouse buttons to navigate around in here. Option and right mouse button zooms in and out. Option and middle mouse button pans and moves around. So you use the same buttons for navigation in this window as you do in your perspective viewport. Okay, this cube here, here's my animation curve for its movement. And what I can do is I can open up this cube here, and I can see its position, scale, and rotation attributes, and I can see it's the X position that we've got this curve in, that it's moving along. All the other ones, there's no change there. This line is flat, it means there's no movement in the Z or the Y, it's only moving side to side in X. Now if I select these keyframes, I've got a couple of default animation styles across the top of my timeline window. I'm going to change these to linear, which takes out that smoothing at the start and end of the keyframe. So if I compare these two boxes animating now, I can see that the top box, which is this one here, it moves at a constant speed. There's no acceleration, there's no slowdown. It's very mechanical and just moves at the same speed. The box below it has a little bit of acceleration and then a little bit of a slowdown. What's really important about this is that both of these boxes' keyframes are at exactly the same point in time. They're both starting their animation from frame 0, and they're both finishing their animation on frame 50. But the in-between movement is different, and the acceleration and the deceleration is changing for the two different cubes. So this is really important because this is how we produce character with animation. We change how these movements happen in between keyframes. If I wanted a really linear, mechanical, robotic type of movement, this linear motion would be useful. If I want something a bit more smooth and organic, then this bottom motion with its curved keyframe easing, as we call it, would be more appropriate. If I want to do some really punchy, snappy animation where this box has a lot more energy, we can do something a little bit different. So I'm just going to pause that for a second, and I'm going to duplicate this again and move this up. So I've got 3 of these. So this box here, I want it to be really punchy and springy and have a lot of life to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my FCurve, and this is this cube here. I need to rename it Cube 2 because they've both got the same name at the moment. Cube 2, here we go. Position in the x-axis. It's a linear movement at the moment, so it's doing the same thing as the cube in the middle. I want it to really accelerate super fast, zip across, and then slow right down. So what I can do is I can select my keyframe here, and I can make it a spline keyframe, which is a Bezier handle. You'll know those from drawing curves in Illustrator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the angle of this curve so that from this keyframe there's a really rapid change in speed and then it really sort of slows right down. So when we look at function curves, a curve that is steep or closer to vertical means fast movement. A curve that is flat or more horizontal means slow movement. So if we look at that and hit play, now I've actually pulled that one a little bit too far. I'm just going to pull it back a little bit. There we go. Okay, so now we can see three boxes. They've all got the same keyframes, but their function curves, their in-between animation is all different. So the bottom one is the default one, which has a little bit of smoothing on it. The middle one is linear with no smoothing at all. And the top one has an extremely exaggerated acceleration away from the keyframe, and then eventually, after almost coming to a stop, hits the last keyframe at frame 50. So as I said before, the really important thing about this is that all these boxes have exactly the same keyframes. It's just the in-between motion that is different. And this timeline, these F-curves in the timeline, are what we use to control that in-between motion. Okay, so we've got DopeSheet, which controls the timing of our keyframes, and we've got our F-curves, which controls the movement in between keyframes, and that's really important for being able to fine-tune animation.